Welcome to the Jewish Orthodox Women's Medical Association podcast. I'm your host, Elisa Minkin, and I'm really honored and really excited to be here today with Asher Lovy. And I already forgot to say that I am a general pediatrician and I'm a proud JOMA member. Thank you so much for doing this with me.
Sure, thanks for having me on.
Asher Lovy is an abuse survivor and director of ZA'AKAH, not to be confused with Zaakah, which raises awareness about child sexual abuse in the Orthodox Jewish community, advocates for legislative reforms, and operates a Shabbat and Yom Tov mental peer support hotline. So first of all, I have to give the trigger warning that we're going to be discussing very sensitive topics and it may be triggering for some people. I also want to say, I hope everybody listens. This is not specifically for a subgroup of abuse survivors. This is for everybody. I will also give a halachic disclaimer. This is a medical mental health focused podcast. We do not discuss halachic issues at all. There is a lot of talk now about preventing child sex abuse, particularly post the Chaim Walzer scandal, which we are not going to describe if you haven't heard about it. There's lots of resources that you can listen to, and people can also listen to the interview you did with Soul Sessions with KK. I don't want to overlap with that. That was an amazing interview. So I totally recommend people listen to KK, which is Karen Corn's podcast, your episode with her. So I think it's great that we're focusing on prevention. And I think when it's done right, it's really, really important. But I think we also have a lot more to do and a lot more to understand. I think there's a tremendous amount still of myths and misunderstandings. And that's what I want to go into here. Mm-hmm. So if you could just start by talking about what ZA'AKAH does, that would be amazing.
Sure. So we started out initially to raise awareness about the issue of sexual abuse in the community. Initially, the way we did that was through public protest. These days, it's more, the awareness side is focused more on publishing articles in traditional media and social media about about sexual abuse, about the issue, about the prevalence, about how to prevent it, about how to spot it, how to address it. We also publicize cases that are in the public interest. To both raise awareness about the issue generally and also to make sure that the community is informed of potential dangers in specific cases. We also advocate for legislative reforms aimed at getting justice for survivors or preventing child sexual abuse in the first place. We worked on the Child Victims Act. We worked on Aaron's Law, which mandated abuse prevention education in public schools. We worked on the child marriage ban, and we're working on the Adult Survivors Act, which hopefully will pass this year, which will open up a 1-year retroactive window for adult survivors of sexual violence, like the Child Victims Act, but for adults. And we operate a Shabbat and Yom Tov mental health peer support hotline. It's open day and night every Shabbat and Yom Tov. And we provide referrals for survivors to either legal resources, mental health resources, or any other resources that they may need.
That's a lot. That's really a lot. So that's really a lot what you're doing. It really is. And I don't know other groups that are doing a lot of what you're doing. There are other organizations out there working on this area.
Yeah, there aren't any organizations, as far as I know, in the Jewish world that is specifically focused on legislative advocacy around sexual abuse. I didn't spot any when I was doing, lobbying in Albany for these various bills. We've also been active in a number of other states other than New York. We've also been active in trying to pass some federal legislation that would essentially incentivize states to adopt things like the Child Victims Act. So in that sense, we're unique in that we're focusing specifically on legislative advocacy for sexual abuse. And the idea behind that is that, we initially started, when ZAAKAH initially started, we thought, we could bring change to the community. We can change things from within. We can inspire people to drive change from within. It became very quickly apparent that that was not going to happen. because change from within generally doesn't happen in any situation, not just here. And we decided to shift our approach to, we're going to continue advocating and we're going to continue raising awareness, but what we're really going to focus on is making sure that in the event that somebody from the community wants help, that they won't have to stay within the community to get it, that they could come to us and we'll help them, because it takes a lot to get someone from the community to come forward. But once they do, within the community, there aren't any resources available to them, or there aren't necessarily trustworthy resources available to them. So we wanted to make sure that, we may not be able to change the community from within, but we'll be there waiting for anybody who needs help. And part of that was ensuring that they even have access to justice in the first place, which necessitated the passing of the Child Victims Act.
Right, and I want people to really understand. So let's go back to just some basic information, because I don't think people really understand what happens, like how many children are at risk of being molested, how many of these children actually disclose it. I think we have to start with that.
Yeah, so the generally accepted prevalence numbers are 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys. There are conflicting studies about the exact prevalence, but any prevalence study you look at that's done decently is going to show a pretty high prevalence of sexual abuse in the general population. It's hard to study the Orthodox world because we resist study, especially in this kind of thing. People are scared to talk because of shidduchim, because of perceptions, because they have a bunch of people telling them it's usher to even talk about it because it's stigmatized, so they're scared to admit it. So it's difficult to collect statistics on the Orthodox world. We have no reason to assume that the prevalence is lower. Whether it's higher or not is a different question, but we have no reason to assume that it's lower. Now, off the, I think RAIN publishes statistics on the prevalence of reporting. It's extremely low. There are studies. There was one study in Germany that found that among Catholic survivors of child sexual abuse, the average age of disclosure was 52.
Ooh,
so,
wow.
yeah, and most studies will show a range of 20, 30, 40, 50 years. It's certainly not an immediate thing. When you hear cases of children coming forward to parents and it gets reported to police, it's extremely, extremely rare. Most cases, I mean, I could tell you even from Zaakah and doing this work for 10 years, the vast majority of people that we deal with are adults who are sexually abused as children. It is incredibly rare that we get reached out to by a child, to help them, because typically they're too scared to come forward in the moment. So that's in the general population that the reporting prevalence is very low, and then of course the conviction rate in the general population is extremely low. Maybe out of 1,000, you'll get, I don't know, like 3 or 4 who will sit in jail for a day. So in general, it's a very difficult topic. In the community, it's even more difficult a topic because you have organizations like Aguda who will say this on the record, that you have to ask a Rav before reporting sexual abuse to the authorities. You have many Rabbanim and organizations that will say that without being dumb enough to put it down on paper. It's this general attitude that it's Masira if you report against another Jew. And again, there's a general terror of anybody being seen as being part of a stigmatized group for the purposes of shidduchim, of housing. I mean, there's a case that we're dealing with now, that a survivor of years and years of child sexual abuse is suing her abuser, and her abuser managed to arrange in the community that no school will accept her children. Right? She's fighting anyway, but it takes an incredible amount of courage when it's ruining your life, your family's life, when it's making you a pariah. So the prevalence either equal or higher, but the rates of reporting are much lower. And just to underscore that point, that in the 2 years that the Child Victims Act look-back window was open, there were 10,857 cases filed. Of those, maybe 250 were Jewish cases. And of that, maybe, I don't know, maybe a couple dozen were Orthodox cases. And, you know, there are a lot of Jews in New York. There are about 1 million Jews in New York. There are, I don't know, 150,000 Orthodox Jews in New York. Just if you break it down by population, the proportion of lawsuits should be much higher, just based on standard prevalence. But you know, it's a mark of how scared people are to come forward that there weren't more, because we definitely know that there are more victims. We definitely know that.
Right. And I want to just emphasize that this is a human problem, not a Jewish or religious problem. I've heard people say, well, we shouldn't air our dirty laundry. Everyone has this problem.
Yeah, the way I tend to discuss it or to explain it to people is that it's a problem everywhere. You know, there's nowhere really that's completely safe from it, which is why it's important that you know that prevention measures are taken, you know, seriously. But the thing is, each culture and community and you know will have different ways of manifesting the problem, right? So you have, let's say in the general population, you have rape cases that occur on college campuses, and often the discourse around it is that prevents, you know, the victims from feeling comfortable coming forward is, you know, what was she wearing?
Right.
Maybe she wanted it and she changed her mind when she realized she didn't actually like the guy. She was drinking a lot. You know, you can't trust her. She slept with 10 other guys. In the frum world, it's a little different. It's, you know, this guy's, it's not true. We know him. How dare you? You're a miser. You know, you're ruining this guy's parnassa. You know, so-and-so Rav said it's not possible. You know, why didn't you go to Beis Din? It's all these like the shidduchim that, you know, each culture has its own way of manifesting this problem. But in general, I think rather than discussing, you know, who has it worse, whether it's the Catholics or the Orthodox or the Haredim versus modern Orthodox, I think that the single biggest indicator, what people should be focused on in examining whether the community they live in has an increased prevalence of sexual abuse, is you look around and see, is there an air of impunity for perpetrators? Can someone assume that they can get away with it if they live in your community? I'll give a vague enough example, but just to underscore the point with something that people can concretely understand. The city of Baltimore, or at least Jewish Baltimore, is the single worst place I've seen in my life for survivors of sexual abuse. There are a tremendous number of abusers in Baltimore who have gotten away with it, or have not only gotten away with it, or have been protected by institutional Jewish Baltimore, right? So if you live in Baltimore, look around, see what is the penalty for people who sexually abuse children, if they're still allowed in shul, if they're, you know, if there's money raised for their defense, if people are threatening the victims who came forward, you know, if the abusers are still honored in shul, if they still retain their positions in institutions, you can fairly assume that the prevalence is high, and you can fairly assume that abusers are going to be specifically targeting those institutions because they know that they can get away with it. Right. So is it Haredi problems and Orthodox problems? I don't know. You can have a Haredi shul or a Haredi school that takes the issue very seriously, takes reporting very seriously, takes prevention very seriously, and the prevalence in that institution will be lower than a modern Orthodox institution that doesn't do any of those things.
You know, that is such an important point. I want to underscore it because that's one of the main reasons I want to interview you. I want people to understand that we all have a role in making our community safer, and not to just say, well, point fingers at another type of community. And I also want to point out that when you're mentioning Baltimore, some people will say, well, that's Lashon Hara. You're slandering an entire community. What you're doing is slandering people. I'm sure you hear that. Yeah,
I do. I get it all the time. But, you know, the fact is, it's Litoelis Harabim.
Litoelis, right.
That we publicize these cases. It's Litoelis Harabim that people know about the problems where they live, which is why we publicize all these cases. You know, we could say it's Lashon Hara and sweep it under the rug, but like the question we always ask people is, okay, so you feel it's Lashon Hara that we're talking about it. What if it was your daughter? You would have moved heaven and earth to make sure that she was protected, or if she was chas v'shalom abused, that she had some justice. And everybody always gets, everybody, of course, if it was my daughter, I would kill the guy, I would castrate him, I would whatever. Everybody always has his grand. It doesn't mean anything, because, I've heard people say, of course, if this person did it, if they did it, I would rip him limb from limb. All these people are covering up, because there are abusers that they typically tell me this in the process of trying to get me to shut up about something. There was a case I was dealing with of a man who allegedly raped a number of women, and we were publicizing the case, and we were talking about it openly, and someone called me up and said, listen, I'm this guy's friend. I've known him for a while. He really turned his life around. You really shouldn't do this to him. He has a wife, he has kids, it's parnassa, it's lashon hara, it's this, it's that. And I'm saying, like, what if he got hired to babysit your kids, and he fed me this line, like, I of course, I take the issue seriously. If I knew that he did it, believe me, I'll be first in line to tear his head off. I'll kill him, I'll castrate him, right? Except that this guy raped friends of mine. So I know he did it, right? I can't say that out loud. I can't say his name when I'm talking about it, obviously for legal reasons, but right. I know he did it because he raped my friend. And here's this guy telling me if he did it, I'll rip him limb from limb. On the same time, he's calling me to tell me that I'm wrong for publicizing it, and that I'm wrong that he didn't do it because he couldn't have, because I know him, right? It's this weird, like, Schrodinger's sexual abuse problem where like it simultaneously exists, and is a very serious problem that we have to take seriously and seriously address and do serious things to prevent, because it's such a serious problem. But this case didn't happen, and that case didn't happen, and here the victim's a liar, and here they're some OTD malcontent with an ex to grind, and here it's Masir if you talk about it, and here it's not possible because he's a Baal Tshuva and he's got a heart of gold. And like every single case, there has never been a single case, including Walder, where everybody has agreed, this guy probably did it. There's always somebody who's contacting me or contacting somebody, whichever organization is dealing with, saying, no, you're making a big mistake. Of course, it's a huge problem. It's a huge problem. I know. I've known people who have abused people in the past, but this guy, what makes your friend so special? I'm sorry. People have to realize that it happens, that abusers are not the one-dimensional monsters that they hope that they are on TV. You watch SVU and it looks like this guy looks like a pedophile. No, these are people who look like everyday people. Many times they're charismatic, they're beloved. They need to be, because they need to not only groom the children to abuse them, they need to groom the parents, the community around them, to make sure that in the event that the child comes forward, the community already, is in the palm of their hand. I've had cases where, on the subject of grooming, just to underscore the point, there have been parents, and this happens a lot. There are parents who call me up and they tell me, there's a Rebbe in my yeshiva who's very physical with the kids, and we've told him to stop, and he doesn't. And everybody knows it. Like, he'll give the kids massages, and there was one who called me and said the Rebbe's massaging the kids' feet, or they're just being like a little inappropriate.
Yeah.
And when they raise the concerns with the administration or even with other parents, the response often is, oh, well, that's just how he is, right? That's just how he is. But what that means is that if a child comes forward and says, this Rebbe like abused me, then they're going to be like, oh, yeah, you're probably misunderstanding, it's just how he is. You probably just misunderstood, So, when it comes to prevention policies, when it comes to taking people who disclose seriously, when it comes to taking the issue seriously, you can't have these carve-outs. You either take the issue seriously or you don't. There's no in between. There's no, I take the issue seriously, except in this case, you got it wrong. You have to take the issue seriously. That's it. You have to take allegations seriously. You have to follow whatever protocols are set, are set, which they should be in public, and not engage in this game of like, oh, well, it's this person's problem. It's not a problem here. It's their problem. But this person couldn't possibly have done it. No, it's a serious problem. that in every case needs to be taken seriously, whether there's one allegation or whether there's 20.
Right. I want to go back a little bit and talk about the Child Victim Act and the Adult Survivors Act. And I want people to really understand why this is important, because I know you're hearing people say, why do we need to dredge up old stuff?
Yeah, so this is an argument that I had to have a lot while fighting for the Child Victims Act. I will say, once the Child Victims Act passed, it was very satisfying to tell every single person who had these objections that, you know, you could go pound sand because I just won. But the Child Victims Act was essentially, so it was a 13-year fight to do a few things. The first would be to prospectively extend the statute of limitations criminally. So criminal statute of limitations was 23. It was 5 years, but it only started after the victim turned 18. So practically speaking, that was age 23. So it extended it to age 25 for misdemeanor offenses, age 28 for felony offenses, and it also extended the list of felonies for which there is no statute of limitations in New York. It also removed the 90-day notice of claim requirement to sue a public institution. So it used to be that if you wanted to sue a public institution in New York for anything really, but you know, specifically for sexual abuse, you had to, within 90 days of the incident happening, you had to file a notice of claim with them, essentially telling them, look, this happened and we're planning on suing you. If you didn't, then you would be barred from filing a claim, which essentially meant that against public institutions, the statute of limitations was 90 days. It extended the civil statute of limitations to age 55. And most importantly, and most controversially, it opened up a 1 year, which was later extended to 2 year retroactive window, during which any case that had been previously barred by the statute of limitations was revived and could be brought in court. Allowing for anyone who, you know, had previously aged out of the statute to bring their case in court. And people had all sorts of reasons why they felt this was unfair. First was, you know, you're going to bankrupt our yeshivas, and this was a line that Aguda was pushing extremely hard while lobbying strongly against the Child Victims Act. And one of the shocking things about that argument is, you know, anybody who knows how a lawsuit works, how institutional insurance works, knows that one lawsuit is not going to close a yeshiva. And every time Aguda would trot this out, like, you know, we would ask if we could, well, how much abuse do you think you're responsible for exactly if you think your yeshivas are going to go bankrupt, you know? And of course, that's not a question that they ever wanted to answer in public. The other concerns were, you know, obviously there's the usual, you know, what are you doing? You're going to destroy the community. You're going to make Yiddishkeit look bad. It's Chil Hashem, right? So those I don't really care about because they're patently stupid. And then there was the argument that, like, look, how far back do you want people to be held responsible? Like, why should an institution, you know, that has had a complete administrative turnover be responsible for what happened 40 or 50 years ago? Like, you take a look at the Yeshiva University case, which is a big one. People are pushing back hard on that. There were 38 plaintiffs lined up to file lawsuits for years. They were just waiting for the Child Victims Act. And this was something that people would ask, even though there were administrators still left from that era when the Child Victims Act passed. They were saying, like, look, this was in the 70s, you know, this was in the 70s. How could you hold the current administration of Yeshiva University responsible for what happened then? Clearly things must have changed. And the answer to that was, you know, Yeshiva University proudly lists the year it was founded when in all of its fundraising stuff, right? It says we have a proud legacy of over 100 years of education. And therefore you should donate to us. Here are the great luminaries that used to be at Yeshiva University, the Rav, this one, that one, you know, here are all the people that came out of Yeshiva University who are great. And if you could build off of that, you know, if you could build off of your legacy for the good stuff, who said that that we can't hold you responsible for the bad stuff? Who told you that you get to just walk away from all the bad stuff you did, you know? The example I gave, and not to make it about any one specific institution, that was just an example that people can understand. A lot of institutions have this problem. It's like, you know, let's say a yeshiva in Borough Park, you know, has the same question, and they haven't been around as long, but this happened 30 years ago, you know, And let's say it's a completely different administration. The board is completely different. The principals are completely different. Faculty is completely different. Why should we be held responsible? Well, you have a mortgage on the building, that you agreed to pay for the next 30 or 50 years. If you called the bank and you said, listen, we have a different administration. The people here now are not the ones who signed the mortgage. Like, we don't feel that we should be responsible for paying this anymore. They'd laugh at you, and if you try to actually doing that, they'd take your building away, because there are certain things that cost money. There's your building, there's the lights, there's the food, there's the insurance, there's all sorts of things. There's the maintenance, and there's the cost of the sexual abuse that you covered up.
I just want to clarify. These suits are because they covered up abuse, not just that it happened in their building or under. They knew about it. That's what the suit is for.
Yeah. So this was another thing that Aguda and other opponents of the Child Victims Act are pushing. The idea that well, it's not our problem. Sexual abuse happens. It's a thing that just happens. You're going to hold us responsible for every. Can you imagine every single victim of child sexual abuse in the yeshiva suing? It would be crazy. How are we supposed to know? What are we supposed to do? So really, the only way you have a cause of action against an institution, or really anybody, is if they had a duty, if they either knew or should have known. So either through negligence they didn't know, or they did know, and they did nothing, and they facilitated it. So, for example, if they didn't have any sort of reasonable policy for supervision or prevention, if they didn't do any due diligence on staff that they really should have, that had they done like a routine background check, or routine checking, they're checking the references on their resume, they would have found out that this person was fired from their previous job for molesting children, or if they received a complaint and brushed it off, and then later abuse happened, that's a cause for action. So no one's being sued just because abuse happened. It's because they've been negligent. Either negligent or actively enabling the sexual abuse of children. So there's a cost to this. I was telling yeshivas right and left, listen, you're looking at this as an existential threat. I'm looking at this as a budgeting problem. If you were going to employ rebbeim who are going to sexually abuse children, you probably should have budgeted for the eventual liability. The fact that you didn't is your problem, not the survivors. So, these are the arguments that we were having over the course of the Child Victims Act. And these arguments weren't just playing out in the frum world. They were playing out, these exact same arguments were playing out in the general population as well. It was playing out with the Catholics, it was playing out with the Boy Scouts, it was playing out with all sorts of institutions. And the answers were always the same to each of them. And eventually it became such a problem for New Yorkers who were watching this fight play out in public, were so disgusted by the fact that, the legislators who were there were essentially saying, yeah, we don't care. We're getting votes and donations from these large institutions lobbying against it. We're going to continue stopping it. Every single person in New York knows someone who was sexually abused. It's that prevalent. Like, every single person knows someone, right? So there's only so long that you can get away with those arguments before people realize that their conscience hurts. And that's what happened in 2018. It was a major electoral issue, the Child Victims Act, where people were so disgusted by their party blocking this that they got rid of it, that they got rid of them and they passed the Child Victims Act. And you see the accountability happening in many institutions. You see it happening in the Catholic Church. You see it happening in the Boy Scouts. You see it happening in the conservative and reform movements in Judaism. They're doing massive investigations now to find out, and they're uncovering things that for years and years were covered up. So, it's not just an us problem to go back to that point. But the fact of the matter is, sexual abuse is an incredibly harmful thing. It can, it causes depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation, self-harm, relationship problems, eating disorders, lifelong psychological problems, the inability to work. There are lost wages involved. There was a study done that showed that the average lifetime impact in terms of dollars per victim was about $250,000 per person, right? So who's paying that? Who's paying that if not for the people and institutions who are responsible? So that's why the Child Victims Act was necessary, and that's why it's important that survivors have access to the courts, because it's not, it leaves a real impact. It's not something that you just walk away from. It leaves a real impact, and unless someone's going to pay for it, the person who did it or the entity that's responsible for enabling it should foot the bill.
Right, no, absolutely. And it's not just about justice for survivors, it's also about accountability.
Yeah.
Which
actually, on that point, one of the arguments that we had to have during the Child Victims Act was, we had to overplay it's not so much about the money, it's more about justice. I always hated that. I really did. I tried not to engage in that argument, because as far as I'm concerned, it's money owed, regardless of why. Someone doesn't have to be seeking justice. They could be after money because they're owed that. And
right.
Somebody actually called me up after the Child Victims Act passed. I had such an nachas from this. They called me up and they said, listen, I was abused when I was a kid and it really affected me, but I'm over it now. I have a life, I've moved on, I have a wife, I have kids, I'm a happy person, but you know what? I'm owed this money and I want it. And can you help me get a lawyer? And I was like, absolutely. No one has to justify why they want money from their abuser. The money's owed.
Right. I mean, people have lawsuits for a lot less than this.
Exactly.
But also the accountability. And I think that's really important, because you talked about how institutional change is not going to happen from within.
Yeah. I mean, you take a look like on the subject of the accountability part of it. You take a look at what's happening now with, it was really hard to track the Child Victims Act lawsuits when they were being filed. So while the window was open, it was very difficult, because you would essentially have to go through each borough's daily filings and look at them and find Jewish cases. It became impossible. So what we did was we waited until the window was closed, and then we got the entire list of cases and we combed through it looking for it. And we're posting these cases, and these people are still employed. There are alleged abusers who are still working with children. And as we post them, people are messaging us like, "Oh, holy crap! This is the principal of our school. This is a rebbe. This is our neighbor. This is the guy who sits next to our kids in shul. This is this keeps happening. This is the COO of a major Jewish nonprofit. Like, holy crap! How did we not know? Well, that's what this is for, And there actually have been cascading lawsuits that have happened as a result. There was one guy, I'm not going to mention names, but there's one guy who was sued, an executive of a prominent Jewish organization. He was sued for abuse that he allegedly committed in a shul, working as a youth director. So that lawsuit we made public, and slowly people started realizing this guy worked at camps. He worked at this camp and that camp and this camp. And, he bounced around a lot between these camps, and people started coming out and saying, we had really weird interactions with this guy. And then there was one person who reached out and said, yeah, I also had a really weird interaction with this guy. And as he thought about it, wait, no, it was more than weird. Like, this guy actually, and there's another lawsuit filed against them as a result of that. So there are victims who have joined, on existing lawsuits. There are victims who are barred by the statute of limitations because they missed the window, but they're assisting in other lawsuits like that. That's why this is so important, because we have to be able to name these people. We have to be able to identify them, and you can't do that if there's no legal mechanism, because the risk assumed by somebody who just speaks out against their abuser without the protection of the legal system is tremendous. To just go out and say this person abused me, they can sue you into oblivion. And if you happen not to have enough money to defend yourself, you're going to end up settling, or you're going to end up losing. Even if you're telling the absolute truth. So that's why this is so important, because there are abusers right now, there are abusers right now who are continuing to abuse, and the only way that they're going to be stopped is if they can be sued in court. And people are like, oh, well, why are people suing? Why didn't they file a criminal case? So while we're working on the Adult Survivors Act, there are people who I've been working with, who have gone through that process, and the criminal system didn't work for them. There's one of the most notable examples is part of the coalition that's working on the ASA is Amber Gutierrez, who's a model and who was abused by Harvey Weinstein. She went to the police to report Harvey Weinstein after he attempted to sexually assault her in a hotel room, and she went to the police. She told them, and they hooked her up with a recorder, and they sent her back. And she, the absolute hero that she is, she actually agreed. She went back and she caught an incident on tape. Like Harvey Weinstein tried to assault her again while she was wearing a recorder. And she goes back to Cy Vance in Manhattan, and she hands him the tape, and he declines to prosecute. But what do you do in that case? She has a recording of it happening, and he declined to prosecute. What do you do? So the people don't understand why survivors go through the civil system. It's because the criminal system doesn't represent you. It's a state's case against the criminal. The victim is just a witness. The evidentiary burdens are much higher. The DAs are overworked. They don't necessarily care. No one's representing the interests of the victim. So cases slip all the time. They decline prosecution. The cops filled out the paperwork wrong. They did it. There's all sorts of things. Like, no one's representing you in the process. The only way a survivor gets represented, their own interest represented, is if they file a civil case. Their lawyer represents them. The entire process is intended to be their case against their abuser, not somebody else's representation of their case, their own case, which is why so many people opt for the civil system instead of the criminal system, because the criminal system very often doesn't work. But just to temper that, because there's been a push lately on the part of many in the Haredi world to say, oh, well, the police aren't going to help you anyway. You may as well go to Batei Din. Like, Batei Din are much worse, because at least the criminal system is public. It's accountable. You can see what the process looked like. In Batei Din, it's people just deciding on a whim. There's no public record. There's no accountability. You don't necessarily know who the dayanim are. You can't sit there and watch a Beis-Din process. There's nowhere to go, right? So it's an entirely closed process that's open to all sorts of biases. There's no appeals process, but they are corrupt notoriously. And they have no enforcement authority. So I just wanted to make that point, lest anybody come away from this saying like, oh, well, then we shouldn't bother to report. No, you should, absolutely. If for no other reason, then you're leaving a paper trail so that if the next person comes in and reports, their case is actually stronger, right? But there's a reason why we have a civil and a criminal system in this country. It's because the criminal system is going to work in certain cases, and the civil system is going to work in other cases. And the civil system is where you go for restitution, and the criminal system is where you go for justice. So yeah, I just wanted to make sure no one got the wrong idea in what I was saying.
So going back to a criminal case, because I think a lot of people have this misconception that, they hear about something, say they hear about it through you, and they say, well, it's just allegations. We'll wait to figure out what happens. So can you give us sort of a picture of how it actually works? And people should keep in mind, again, that a lot of these cases don't actually end, right, in a conviction, even if it did happen.
Yeah, one of the strangest things one of the strangest questions that people ask is like, oh, you're posting this allegation. Where's your proof? Like, I posted a complaint. It's the beginning of a lawsuit. You hang on for the trial. That's where the evidence is going to be. They want me to produce video. Like, what are you doing? I posted an allegation, which I think is another point that people have to understand. The way to process an allegation of sexual abuse is not immediately to assign guilt or to assume innocence, right? There's this idea that people have that innocence proven guilty is a requirement on us culturally or individually. It's not. The presumption of innocence until proof of guilt is meant to ensure that the adversarial process that we have for both civil and criminal justice play out in a way that ensures due process. We're not going to go in assuming a person is guilty, because if we do, the case is going to be biased. But that doesn't require any of us to be credulous morons about it and pretend that we didn't hear an allegation. You know, one of the examples I like giving is, if somebody walked out in front of in Times Square and shot 10 people in the head, they would have the presumption of innocence until proof of guilt in court. But you shouldn't sell them firearms, you know, and they're going to sit in jail pending trial because they're dangerous, you know. And that's the thing. Like, it's the same thing applied to how we should process sexual assault allegations, sexual abuse allegations. Is we don't have to say, you know, the believe victims thing doesn't mean that we immediately say definitively this person is guilty. This may be a controversial statement coming from me for some people, but that's not really what it's about. Because if you're in the business of definitively assigning guilt when an allegation is made, then, you know, then the other side can essentially do the same thing and say, no, I definitively say it's innocent. Have either of you looked at the evidence? No, right? So that's, you know, obviously in a case like Chaim Walder, you know, at some point you do have to, you know, you do have to make a decision. You know, I am comfortable saying, you know, under threat of lawsuit by his estate, that Chaim Walder was a prolific pedophile, right? Like, I'm fine saying that. Sometimes you really have to, but that's not the point of why these allegations are publicized. The point is, we're notifying the community about a potential danger. Taking it seriously means that you take that potential danger seriously. It means you take the process seriously, right? So when someone comes to you and tells you, you know, hands you a lawsuit, right, and says, this is what this person is accused of doing, right? For 7 years, they molested a kid, right? Your duty is to take precautions. What that looks like is, don't necessarily have that person around in shul. Does that mean that they did it? No, but they represent a potential threat. Do you want them to take? Do you want to take that chance? You know, an example I like giving of this is, like, let's say you were hiring a babysitter, right? And everybody always has these cheshbonos about why they don't want to, you know, take any of the precautions that they should be. It's like, what if you were hiring a babysitter, and there's this you know, there's this guy 5 houses down who, you know, you've known for a long time, and you want to hire him as a babysitter, and you do. And for a month he's a babysitter, and the person who recommended him a month later comes and tells you, by the way, you know, I'm sorry I didn't tell you earlier, but, you know, he's accused of molesting all 3 of his sisters. You know, like, what parent wouldn't be furious? You know, all of a sudden, whatever, okay, it's not a babysitter, it's my kid's teacher, it's, you know, it's the guy who sits next to him in shul, it's the rav of my shul, it's this guy's uncle, it's this Diane, it's whatever. Like, all of a sudden, then they don't care. It doesn't affect them as acutely. They don't care as much. Why? This is a potential danger, you know.
You know, but I think it goes back to the denial mode that people go into, and they'll say, you know, I'm not going to be judge and jury. There's just allegations, and then they'll say, but I know the person. You know, there was an amazing piece, I can't remember the title, by Shira Berkovitz from Sacred Spaces, which is a great organization, as you know. And she went into all the psychology and all the issues people have. And it was really good, because I think it's good to understand where people are coming from, so you can debunk it, or try to get people to realize what they're doing psychologically. And she spoke to someone who said, I know everything you're telling me about this guy, like, intellectually, but I would still have him babysit my kids.
You know, I've gotten that too. I've heard people say that to me about people that I know for a fact did it. You know, obviously, when Zaakah posts something in public, you know, our policy is only to post stuff that's backed with public information. So a lawsuit, a media article, you know, a criminal complaint. But there are certain, and there are a lot of cases we don't have any inside information on. There are cases that we do. Obviously, I can't say that in public, right? But there are cases I've heard. There was a case where I actually I knew for a fact that guy had done it, and here's this guy telling me that he would hire the guy as a babysitter for his kids, and like, it's unbelievable, you know. We have people messaging us and attacking us like, how dare you, it's Lashon Hara, you're tarnishing this guy's name. Oh, if it turns out that he's innocent, will you apologize? No, I'm not going to apologize. That's not what we're here for. Again, we aren't in the business of assigning guilt. We aren't in in the business of saying definitively this person did it until there's a conviction. What we're saying is that the principal of your school is accused of molesting a child, right? Maybe don't have that guy around your kids while it's being worked out whether he molested a child. That's it. There are like so many other people who could be principal of this school who haven't been accused of molesting children.
No, but I think that they look at it, I think that they, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I think that they look at it as, first of all, very often the person being accused is somebody, like you said, well-known, beloved, respected, charismatic, and the person who's the accuser is somebody they don't consider to be equally on that level, right?
Yeah, I mean, look.
Number one,
Yeah.
I'm not done. And that's a separate issue of who, who are the people most likely to be victims and why there's such an incredible power differential. But also they're going to say, well, we're going to ruin their life. We're going to ruin their life. Everyone's going to know, and they're going to be out of a job, and their whole family, will be completely, stigmatized by that. And we don't even know if it's true.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, this kind of touches on something else that people ask me a lot. What's to stop anybody from just doing this? Like what's to stop someone from just deciding to accuse someone of sexual abuse, just ruining their entire life? It's a question that we get very often, and I think it's a misunderstanding of how the process works, right? We aren't talking about like posts on Twitter or Facebook. Like we aren't talking about anonymous social media postings. We aren't talking about the Whisper, the Whisper Network or the Rumor Mill or the Grapevine or anything like that. We're talking about cases that are filed in court, either criminally or civilly, right? There's a process that needs to be gone through, right? No lawyer that doesn't want to be disbarred and potentially thrown in jail is going to file a suit that they don't believe at least has some merit, right? So the process essentially is you call up a lawyer, you give them the broad outline of the case, and they consider whether they want to move forward with you. And then they, they'll sign an agreement with you, of course, pending, whether they're going to, with the option of backing out if they realize that the case doesn't actually have merit once they start to collect evidence. But, they'll pretty quickly start asking the survivor for evidence, right? Show us enough that we can believe that there's a case here, right? Because there's a certain amount of evidence that's only accessible during the discovery phase, which is when both sides essentially have to prefer things like medical records and emails and correspondence and any other information that is relevant to the case. So a lot of collection of evidence happens then. It's not immediately available, but there does have to be some level of evidence, whether it's text messages, either to the abuser or to or to people at the time. A contemporaneous account of what happened is considered enough to move a case forward. A lawyer has to believe that the case is viable and has merit before they take it. And in a criminal case, it's even harder because you're dealing with two separate gatekeepers. You're dealing first with the police, who have to believe you and have to find probable cause to make an arrest. It's not like someone walks in and says, "Oh, this person abused me." Like, "Oh, really? Oh, well, then we should go arrest them." Like these investigations take a long time. There are all sorts of investigative tactics that are used to determine whether there's probable cause. And then once you pass that bar, you then have to get past the gauntlet at the DA's office, where they have to decide that the evidence potentially is strong enough in your case and that they're willing to take the case and that they have time for it and that it's viable. Like there's so much that has to happen before a lawsuit gets filed. In my 10 years of doing this, I've never personally dealt with a case that turned out to be fake. Once it had already hit a courtroom, once it was already like in the DA's docket, once it was, filed in court, I've never run into, personally, I mean, I know that it happens incredibly rarely. Like one of the most famous cases is the Duke LaCrosse case where, it seemed that there was a definitive finding of falsehood. But it's incredibly rare, and I just want to also mention, like, there's people will say all the time, I know someone who was falsely accused, right? And there are two separate types of reactions possible to that. I've had the conversation two different ways, depending on how they're framing it. A lot of times people have told me, it's false, it's not true, it's, I know someone who is whatever. And I ask them, like, what's the guy's name? And a lot of times when they give me the name, I can tell them, no, here are the facts and your friend did it, I'm sorry, and whether they can process that or not is a different question. And then, other people who are like, oh, it happens all the time. I'm like, name me 3 cases, name me 3, right? And they can't, because it's incredibly rare. I can name 100 cases off the top of my head where it did happen. I can name you 1 off the top of my head where it didn't. So it's
we have statistics on this, right, in the general population, and it's got to be even lower in the Orthodox population because of all the other extra barriers.
So I'm not going to speculate about where it's higher or lower, but
no, I'm not talking about the prevalence. I'm talking about the false allegations. I'm saying the false allegations, the percentage, and I don't know if you have them in front of you. I think I read the max would be 10%, and I think that includes like divorce cases. And as a pediatrician, I can tell you, yes, I've seen false allegations by one parent against another parent that the other parent molested their child, but it was the parent against parent as part of a divorce proceeding. But statistics in the general population are low. It's got to be how much more so in the Orthodox population when there's additional pressure to not disclose.
Yeah, I'm not comfortable speculating about that, because there's all sorts of factors that can go into determining that. But I think what's important for people to understand is what a false report means. I often ask them, do you think that the report against O.J. Simpson was false because he was acquitted? Most people will say no, right? There were a lot of studies on. I had a shocking conversation with a rabbi who is he's one of the rabbinic censors of a very popular From Online media publication, and he published the publication published a case against the Hasidic yeshiva in Borough Park, and then immediately they took it down. And I called this Rav up, and to his credit, he takes my calls even if I yell at him every time. And I asked him, like, what are you doing? And he said, whatever. He gave this whole thing. Most of the people in the lawsuit are dead. I don't see the to'ala. So I had an argument with him anyway. He ended up putting it back up, but he put it up with a disclaimer saying that it should be noted that innocent until proven guilty, and that there are often cases where the allegations are false. I called him up, like, what are you doing? What's wrong with you? Often, what's wrong with you? First of all, this is a side note that I found shocking. Also, I said, I've seen this publication publish all sorts of stories about arrests, burglars, murderers, and whatever,
with no disclaimers attached.
No disclaimers. Why? I've seen you do this. You post a Hispanic man punched a Hasidic guy in the street. You didn't say he's innocent until proven guilty. It's like, oh, well, that's because it's Goyim. It's like, okay, let's move past the fact that you just said that. Why did you say often? And he says, oh, because I read a study that said 23% of allegations are false. And it happens to be that I spent a lot of time reading the research on this, and I know why. It's because during the 70s and 80s, there were a lot of studies that were done, and what they did essentially was they looked up statistics on, they would collect Justice Department statistics, and they would look through them. The statistics are extremely detailed, but how you parse them out is, numbers don't mean anything without context, right? So what they were doing is they were looking at the statistics, and they were saying, okay, so there were a certain number of arrests made and the cases were dropped. There were a certain number of recantations. There was a certain number of cases that were thrown out, in summary judgment. And they're counting those as false allegations, because clearly if they couldn't pass muster, then they must have been false, which is not true.
Right. That cannot be underscored enough. And that's one thing I want people to understand, is just because somebody was acquitted doesn't mean it didn't happen. And when you mention recanting, I read a shocking statistic of in cases where children were not only saying they were sexually abused, but they were actually evidence of sexually transmitted infections, meaning it had to have happened, 50% of them recanted.
Yeah. I mean, just to give a case that's prevalent to the frum world, there was this. This is actually two. I mean, it happened in the same precinct. There was a woman whose husband contacted me a while ago and said that she was being stalked by a guy. She ended up a frum guy. She ended up like engineering a situation where she could get his identity. She goes to the 66th precinct in Borough Park, and she files a report. And the cop at the desk is like, really? You really want to file a report? She's like, what's your problem? Oh, you people, you always come in, you file a report, and the next day you come in and recant. What are you wasting our time for? You're going to end up doing the same thing as everybody else does, right? And she's like, no, I'm serious. I want to report. It's like, all right, fine, whatever. Here's the paperwork. You fill it out, right? So she fills it out. 2 hours later, she gets a call from Shomrim. From some bigwig in Borough Park Showroom saying, like laying it on thick, how could you, this guy, it's probably misunderstanding. He has a parnasa, he needs a parnasa, he has a family, have you no Rahmanis, like really laying it on thick, some veiled threats, So the next day she goes in and recants. The cop's like, I told you, what did you waste our time for, But it actually happened, And then there was another case. A girl got in touch with us. This was one of the rare cases where like a kid actually contacted us about abuse that she witnessed. There was a teacher in yeshiva in Borough Park that there was a girl who put her feet up on the desk, a little chutzpahdik, whatever. But the correct response is like, take your feet off the desk, and if she doesn't listen, assign a punishment, maybe detention, maybe send her to the principal's office, call her parents, whatever. The teacher pulls her phone out, holds it up her skirt, and takes a picture and says, I'm going to send it to the principal. She does this in full view of the entire class. And this one girl stands up, and the absolute hero that she is stands up and tells the teacher, you cannot do that. That's a federal crime. And the teacher says, I could do whatever I want. She's like, no, you can't. That's a crime. What you just did was a crime. If you send it, it's a crime. And she fights with this teacher for a half hour. The teacher ends up not sending the picture to the principal, but the girl takes it a step further and says, you need to delete that off your phone. And the teacher says no. And she says, what possible reason could you have for wanting that picture on your phone so badly? And like, I never had the chutzpah. I was a terrible student. I was thrown out of school many times. I was thrown out of class many times. I never would have said that to, like, the bravery on that girl when she told us that. Such knockoff, like really, this never would have happened when I was in yeshiva. So she calls us up and she says, this is what I witnessed. This is like, okay, as someone in New Jersey, I'm mandated to report in New Jersey, but I'm going to go and report in New York. For abuse that doesn't happen within a family, you have to report to police, not to OCFS. So I drove to the 66th precinct, and I spoke to an officer there. I tried filing a report. He wouldn't take a report from me. He said that we need to talk to the girl. So I said, okay, that's fine. She's a little uncomfortable. He's like, can we do it outside of school? Yeah, I'll go to her house. I said, there's one other thing. She's very scared of what's going to happen to her if her identity gets out. And I taped this conversation with the cop because I wanted a record of this. I said, can you guarantee her anonymity? And he said, yeah, as soon as the SVU gets it, her name is sealed, right? Because she's a minor and it's a sex abuse case, her name is sealed. I said, okay, but like in between, when it gets from you to SVU, how many Shomrim people are going to see it? And he said, and he like deflated, and he's like, yeah, it's a real problem. They have so much control, that pretty much anything that goes through this precinct, like I can promise you I'll get it there as fast as possible, but like I can't promise you that they're not going to know. I'm like, I've had Shomrim call and intimidate people. He's like, yeah, we know, we hate it, but like there's nothing we can do about it. I'm sorry. I was like, okay, so I had to give an honest, I owe it to the people that I represent, who are clients of ZA'AKAH, to give them honest information. I told her, listen, the cop I spoke to, he's going to move it as fast as possible. It might not hit Shomer. It might. Like, this is a decision that you and your mother have to make about whether you want. And I'll be there to support you, and I'll do everything I can. But here's the real facts, and she ended up not saying anything.
You know, and this is an example. It's a horrible story, but I mean, they're all horrible. But this is an example of, okay, so the guy deletes it off his phone. There's no evidence.
Well, she hadn't gotten rid of it off her phone.
Oh, it was on her phone. I see.
No, not the girl. The teacher, the Mora, had taken the photo.
But my point is that she could easily have done that, and so many of these cases, it really also needs to be pointed out. So many of these cases where things actually happen would not have, say, physical evidence.
Yeah. This is something that people misunderstand about what constitutes evidence. And it should be noted, there are cases where there is video evidence, and there are cases where there's DNA evidence. And in a child, DNA evidence is definitive finding of crime.
But how much of the time does that happen?
Right. So not very often, because in order for there to be any physical evidence, it would have to be collected immediately or within 12 or 24 hours, and that usually doesn't happen because disclosure happens way later.
But wait, I want to make one more point, that not all sexual abuse would involve, DNA evidence.
Yeah. So there are a lot of other forms of evidence that, people are like, oh, this term, he said, she said, it annoys me more than anything else, because it's never true. There are all sorts of forms of evidence. There are certain forms of character evidence that are allowed in terms of establishing a pattern. It's a very complicated topic, but you can sometimes get it past. You can sometimes get a person's a historical abuse pattern passed in court. It's a very complicated topic, but less complicated, you have outcry testimony, which is the disclosure made to most immediately to the people around them, right? So it doesn't have to be in the immediate aftermath, it could be years later, but the first people who hear that's evidence, right? Contemporaneous account is evidence. Contemporaneous notes is evidence. Testimony from a therapist is evidence. There's so many things that are considered evidence in these cases that are, that people will say, oh, it's just circumstantial, it's hearsay. No, but the courts count it as evidence. A victim's own testimony is considered evidence. There was a case, the Nehemiah Weberman case had plenty of these types of evidence, but one of the linchpins was they sat her on the stand for 18 hours and they cross-examined her, right? That's evidence, You have
to be able to get through that, though, in terms of the witnesses.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the reasons why many people choose not to come forward, because it could be a traumatic process. But all of these things are evidence. So people are like, oh well, where's your DNA evidence? Probably not going to exist. Where's video? And probably not going to exist. Although I will say, I don't know how they might. There are a number of cases I've dealt with lately where the victims knew that it was about to happen, because they'd been it was an ongoing thing, and at some point later, after a number of years of being sexually abused, they knew that when this person comes, they're going to be abused, and at that point, there's really nothing you could do. So they recorded it, and I'm in absolute awe of people who do that, because I was abused as a child too. I never had the presence of mind to record it, and which is understandable. You have other things on your mind, right? Collecting evidence isn't one of them. But there are cases I've seen recently that, and also sometimes you do have physical evidence, especially if sometimes it's the abuser taking the physical evidence, sorry, not the physical evidence, the video evidence, right?
Right, the pictures of the videos, right?
And as a memento or to distribute, you do have, it's this fundamental misunderstanding of the process that people have that leads them to say things like that and not take it seriously.
Right, but it's still important to understand that even if you've filed a criminal case and they have closed it, it doesn't mean it didn't happen,
Mhm.
right? Isn't there something where they say it's unsubstantiated? They weren't able to substantiate the claim, but it
Yeah.
doesn't mean it didn't happen.
It's funny you mentioned that. I'm not going to mention names here, but there's this prominent case that's playing out now in the courts where the alleged abuser, people knew about the allegations against him. He got away with it for a long time. He retained his positions in the schools and the camps he was working in, because what he would do is he had letters from Child Protective Services that said that they'd received the complaints and investigated and they were unsubstantiated, right? And he would show them to people and say, oh, look, clearly unsubstantiated means that there's nothing to them. It's not true. This is another thing where people don't understand process. Unfounded means it didn't happen. Unsubstantiated means it quite possibly could have. We may have some indications that it did. We haven't met our evidentiary bar, but we're going to keep an eye on this guy. Founded means, this guy's about to have legal problems, This guy going around showing his unsubstantiated letter, anybody who knows what that means, that is an absolute indictment on him. The chutzpah of someone to do that, but it's because that person knew, this abuser knew that no one knows what this process looks like.
He waved his own red flag. He waved his own red flag.
Yeah, he's holding it up. He's holding it up and saying, look at my red flag,
But that's because people don't understand. And that's why, what you're doing is so incredibly important. We have to understand all of this. And from conversations with people, I know that, a lot of people don't. Back to that evidentiary bar, I just want to underscore again that that's pretty high, right? From a criminal case.
Yeah, so in a criminal case, the evidentiary bar is beyond a reasonable doubt. Any lawyer will caution against anybody giving a percentage to what that bar means, but beyond a reasonable doubt doesn't mean that there can't be any doubt. It means it's beyond a reasonable doubt. So 95% likely, right? Which accounts for any other theories of what happened, any inconsistencies, any whatever. It's an extremely high bar. And one of the things that you contend with when trying to meet that bar is you have DAs who know that the bar is very high and that they may be able to prove it in a certain case, but is it worth their time if they have 500 other cases that they're dealing with? And if they decide it's not worth their time, it would be hard to meet that bar. Maybe they can't meet the bar on that charge, and it's not worth charging a misdemeanor or a lesser charge. Like, there's all sorts of reasons why they may opt not to. In a civil case, the bar for damages, which is just simple penalties, is preponderance of evidence. And again, caution against anybody using percentages to describe evidentiary burdens. 50.1%, right? Clear and convincing evidence is the standard for punitive damages, which are often sought in these cases. 75%, allowance for some doubt, but it should be noted also with people who are like, oh, well, you're going to game the system by going into the civil system because the evidentiary bar is so much lower. The evidentiary bar is lower because we set the evidentiary bar extremely high when we're considering whether to deprive a person of their civil liberties. When we're considering whether to deprive them of money, obviously there are fewer consequences there. So we set the bar lower. But it still is. It should be noted. The burden is still placed on the plaintiff in any of these cases to prove their case. It's not on the defendant to defend themselves. The plaintiff has to make a case. The defendant's job in a trial is to poke holes in the plaintiff's case, right? That's the adversarial process. But the plaintiff still has to prove it. And it should be noted that people may say, oh, well, the civil system is just a way of cheating the criminal system. O.J. Simpson lost his civil trial, we're fairly certain he did it, and we could say, actually, we don't have to say we're fairly certain. He did it, right? Because he lost in civil court, right?
The bar was so high for the criminal.
Exactly. Is anybody, and his prosecutor was an idiot, but is anybody going to say, oh, well, O.J. Simpson really didn't do it. The civil standard is so, no, of course not. It's ridiculous. But that's why often victims will turn to the civil system because A, they're represented, B, the barrier to entry is much lower. They still have to prove a case, especially if they want to collect any punitive damages, which, by the way, these cases are taken on contingency, which means that the vast majority of people suing sexual abusers are not paying the lawyer. The lawyer is taking the case on the assumption that they're going to collect, which means that the lawyer is assigning a higher burden than if you just hired them. If you're paying a retainer, right, then you could get a lawyer to do pretty much what you want as long as it's within the ethical guidelines. But if the lawyer is taking a case on contingency, they're going to be laying out a tremendous amount of money, time, and resources. They're going to make sure that that case is viable before they pick it up. But it also means that in the vast majority of cases taken on contingency, the lawyers are going to be seeking punitive damages because they need the money, which raises the evidentiary bar to clear and convincing, which is 75, not 50%. So these are just other things to keep in mind when people are, just saying, oh, whatever, it's a civil system, it doesn't matter.
What is the time frame for both a civil and a criminal case? The reason I'm
Long.
asking is because people say allegations until it's proven. I'll wait.
Long. These cases could take years. The criminal system tends to be a little quicker, but the civil system is slower, and it could take years. And schools are like, oh, well, what are we supposed to do with this teacher that we have? Well, I don't care. I don't care if it takes 10 years. Like, no one entitles you to keep an alleged pedophile on staff. I'm sorry if that's inconvenient, but I'm sorry if you hired your principal six months earlier and now they're being accused of sexual abuse. Like, tough, deal with it. Like, schools owe a duty to their, and this is a thing. This is like, I think this point is one that there can't be any considerations outside of the interests of children and survivors of sexual abuse when it comes to addressing it. There cannot be anything, not institutions, not our yeshiva is going to go bankrupt, not how does this reflect on our community, not shidduchim, not nothing. The only thing we're talking about, pikuach nefesh, I don't think people understand this. Children die every single year as a result of sexual abuse. They die of the psychological consequences. There is nothing that stands in the way of pikuach nefesh. If pikuach nefesh is enough to get Hashem to say, violate my Shabbos, the thing that attests to my creation of the world, violate that, to save my creation, right? To save this person that I made, violate my Shabbos. Who the hell is anybody to say, no, my institution matters more? There was a very important lesson that I learned very early on from a guy by the name of Chaim Glantz. He runs Our Place drop-in center for at-risk kids in Midwood. I worked there for a couple of years, and he taught me a lesson that I've carried through in everything I've done. He said, the second an institution becomes more important than the people it serves, it no longer deserves to exist. No one entitles any institution to its existence. There's no right written in the Constitution that you have a right to run a yeshiva. You don't have a right to hire molesters, right? You absolutely have to prioritize the safety of the children. And if that means placing, a teacher on administrative leave for 3 years while their case plays out, or firing them because they're just a liability, then do it. Like, who gives a crap if they're good fundraisers? Who cares if they're, none of it's worth it. None of it's worth it. If you're not serving the people you're meant to serve, if you don't have the best interests of children at heart, then really, what are you there for? To collect money? Go, I don't know, go into business, go, do something else where you aren't in a position to endanger children.
Right, and it's not an excuse that this person that you're, kicking out of their position, that they have livelihood, that they have family, because why are we prioritizing them over all our children?
Let them go work in an Amazon warehouse. Let them work as an accountant. Let them get a remote job doing copy editing. There's lots of stuff that you could do without being around children. We don't owe them a parnasa, Listen, if they have trouble feeding their families, they could sign up for Tamchei Shabbos. I don't begrudge them that. If someone wants to support their family in the interim, I don't begrudge their family anything, but like the fact of the matter is, like, if you have a choice, the parnasa on this side and child safety on this side, it should be a no-brainer.
Right. And I think people think of it as taking sides. And they'll say we can't be judge and jury. So don't be judge and jury. Don't take sides. Prioritize safety. It's so simple, really.
And the thing is, like, this is something that Shira Berkovitz will say a lot from Sacred Spaces, and Michal Bayar will say a lot from the Bayar Group. I know that I don't know if you've had Shira, but you referenced her organization earlier. Like, one of the things that we keep on repeating, all of us in this field, if you have policies in place where this is how we're going to deal with something, that's not a big deal. I mean, it is. Let's be real. Being accused of sexual abuse is not nothing. But if the process is okay, everybody in the community of this institution knows, right? Someone's accused of sexual abuse, there's going to be a real investigation. This is what the process looks like. It's down on paper and it's public, and it's prescribed beforehand. It's not making it up on the fly. This is what the process is going to look like. It doesn't have to be a big deal. It can be a standardized process. And if it comes back with nothing, fine. Then you bring the teacher back. Unless it's a criminal or civil case, then you leave that. You should prioritize the courts. But let's say, like, the courts aren't involved and the teacher's accused of sexual abuse, right? So, okay, so the teacher goes on leave for 6 months while there's an investigation. The best practices of the investigation are laid out in advance. Everybody knows exactly what's going to happen. They know the process. They know what they're going to be looking for. They know the methodology, and then there's the determination made, and then the teacher's either brought back or fired. It's like that. It's not that big a deal. If the process were followed in every case, are you going to have certain cases where it's not true? Yeah. And the investigation will find that out and bring the teacher back. It doesn't have to be this thing where, like, everybody loses their freaking mind because, like, holy crap, we have to figure out now what we're going to do about this guy. If you have your policies down on paper, everybody knows what's going to happen. There doesn't have to be any ambiguity. You don't have to, like, take sides. It's not taking sides. This is just what we do when this situation arises.
Right, it's absolutely true. And we didn't even get to everything I wanted to do, but we've been talking for a very long time. And I must interview Shira Berkovitz. Shira Berkovitz, I saw that she has an organization, Sacred Spaces, which is devoted, if I'm right, to making our schools and shuls, our communities, safer with those policies, and has a separate organization called Aleinu, I believe. It's a separate website. I went on it with, you can join and you can get those best practices, which unfortunately we just don't have time to go into, and I must interview her. I did interview Rachel Bayar from the Bayar Group on prevention, which we also didn't get into. It is just amazing, everything that you're doing, and it's so important. And I hope that people who listen to this understand how important it is for the survivors and for making our community safer places. And I really, really appreciate you doing this with me.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on.
Thank you. And good Shabbos.
Shabbos.